My name is Robert Gregory, and I'm the Public Affairs Director with the Australian Jewish Association. Jewish and Indigenous Australians have a proud history of working together on important issues. Indigenous elder William Cooper led a significant protest against the Nazis after Kristallnacht. Jews have been heavily involved in the fight for Indigenous causes. Just a couple of examples are the barrister representing Eddie Mabo in the Mabo decision, as well as participants in the Freedom Ride of 1965. One of the most contentious issues today is the proposed Indigenous Voice to Parliament. Several Jewish groups claiming to speak on behalf of the community have come out in strong support of the voice. In contrast, more and more members of the Jewish community are raising concerns with us. I was at a large rally for Israel recently, which is a totally unrelated issue, and at least 5 people came up and approached me with concerns about the voice, asking us to speak out. Previously, the AJA has heard from Indigenous leader Warren Mundine, and today I'm very honoured to speak to Senator Jacinta Nampijinpa Price. Now, Jacinta needs no introduction, but I will say that she's one of the most effective members of Parliament, and it's very hard to believe she was only elected last year. Jacinta is Indigenous, a coalition senator from the Northern Territory, and a prominent opponent of the voice. Thank you so much for joining the Australian Jewish Association today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure, Robert.
Now, I wanted to start by asking you, why are you against the proposed Indigenous Voice to Parliament?
Thank you for that question. I think the first basic principle is the idea that the Aboriginal voice to Parliament basically enshrines racial segregation into our constitution. It also assumes that Indigenous Australians are inherently disadvantaged, and it doesn't actually serve us on the basis of need, but instead the view is taken that as a race we require this bureaucracy in the constitution, and supposedly it's to benefit us. I think that's one of the fundamental first reason is the fact that it is a race-based constitutional amendment, and what I think is really concerning is that within governments there are many organisations that represent. There's many committees, there's many advisory boards that represent the voices of Aboriginal Australians. The proposal suggests that we've never had a voice. In fact, we have always had a voice. Those that have sat at the table for decades are those who are now insisting that this voice to Parliament is a requirement, and it is absurd to suggest that they have never, in fact, themselves had a seat at the table and a voice in the ear of many past governments. So I think it's very dangerous to divide our nation along the lines of race.
Thanks for that. And as I mentioned, several of the major Jewish organizations have declared support for the voice. Do you think there's been enough consultation with Indigenous people who oppose the voice? Or do you feel that voices that challenge the narrative are being sidelined in Australia?
Yeah, absolutely. Voices that disagree have been sidelined, and the mainstream media have a lot to answer for with regard to this, the sidelining of those opposing voices. For a long time, there's been, it's been a racial stereotype that has suggested that Aboriginal people all think the same. I mean, it'd be absurd to suggest that all Jewish people think the same. Or any group of human beings, any group of Australians should think the same. It's absurd. So, it is incumbent on media outlets such as our taxpayer-funded national broadcaster, the ABC, to highlight, to remain, apolitical in this conversation, and also to remain to provide fair reporting, to report those voices of many differing views on this particular topic. I personally, I don't understand how organisations can choose to come out to support what is a concept that doesn't have any detail whatsoever, on the basis it's being sold as sort of like a miracle cure. It's almost like, we have a miracle cure to cancer, but all we need you to do, just believe us, this will do the trick. This will solve all our problems. But we're not going to demonstrate how or show the evidence of this until you've signed your life away. And the lack of detail, the lack of consultation, this false stereotype that we all think the same as Aboriginal Australians, forms the basis for a lot of why organisations have supported this proposal, and the idea that somehow nothing else has worked, therefore this is absolutely going to, because it's being it will be put into our constitution, so therefore it must work. So it's really concerning, it's really dangerous, and it provides the opportunity for this Trojan horse to unfold should the referendum be successful.
Have you been consulted by Jewish organisations, or do you know of prominent Indigenous opponents of the voice that have been consulted by Jewish organisations?
I think the only Jewish organisation that has consulted me is yours. I can't speak on behalf of people like Warren Mundine. I don't know that he's been reached out to. And I think that's the problem, is that people like myself and Warren, we're not being sought out for any sort of understanding as to why we oppose this by organisations. But we have to search out others, unlike your organisation yourselves that have come knocking on our doors. And I think it's really important for anyone to make a decision on this, should be doing so to be well informed before making any decision or coming out to suggest that they support it. We recently had a visit in Parliament yesterday from a woman called Casey Costello, who is from New Zealand, who heads up an organisation that seeks equality and citizenship in New Zealand, who has basically described the way in which a similar sort of setup in New Zealand has been failing the Māori people and the people of New Zealand entirely, because I guess it's there has been too much emphasis on favouring the Māori way of, Māoris as a race now are favoured in terms of having oversight with policy, with legislation before everybody else. I guess I'll give you an example. During COVID, the health policy was that in the rollout of vaccines, that the elderly would be prioritised over other Māori New Zealand citizens. The Waitangi Tribunal argued that that Māoris, and particularly young Māoris, have issues with their health, so therefore it should be the Māori population that is prioritised in terms of vaccinations. So it shifted from taking care of our vulnerable, our elderly, to first offering those vaccinations to Māori only. I mean, if something like that happened in Australia, I think that would be absolutely and utterly outrageous to suggest that, again, not all Aboriginal Australians are disadvantaged, but this model would demand that Aboriginal Australians, regardless of whether we're disadvantaged or not, would be prioritised over the rest of Australia.
I can see how that's very patronising. It's definitely concerning. And as I mentioned, we've been approached by members of the community with concerns, and some of those concerns you've already gone through. The most common ones we hear about: the lack of details by the government, worries about whether an Indigenous voice will actually have a practical impact on Indigenous people's lives, and confusion about why it has to be a constitutional change and it can't be done with through other methods. But one of the most commonly raised issues is the issue of dividing people based on race and how it can have unintended consequences. From Jewish history, at least, we've seen that, and it's usually always negative consequences. Do you have any comment about that?
Absolutely agree. And this is where we have to understand our world history and actually learn from it and not repeat history, especially, what our Jewish communities had to confront historically is absolutely just atrocious. And we don't want to go down along the lines of dividing our nation along the lines of race, because the consequences won't be beneficial to all Australians, especially our most vulnerable. But it opens a can of worms to provide for a dangerous road ahead, and we've really got to understand and learn from this. I mean, I find it astonishing also that big companies, corporates, are jumping on board with this because they want to appear virtuous. So, there are a lot of issues in the Indigenous industry. For example, native title. We still haven't got our head around native title. There are people being recognised in terms of native title and land given back to traditional owners. Some of that land has been land that, for example, car parks on beaches, and then traditional owners now go in and occupy that area. Nobody has any jurisdiction over it apart from those native title holders. Access to what was once public land is now being cut off. This voice to Parliament proposal provides the opportunity for activism, lawfare. And this is the example of what's going on in New Zealand at the moment, is that the Waitangi Tribunal are now demanding, stating that their government continues to breach the treaty and are putting demands on government in terms of breaches. And opening this can of worms and placing ridiculous demands on the government to adhere to. The demands won't stop coming. And the voice to Parliament will be another opportunity for those activists to continue on the path of those demands. It's not just an advisory body. It will be about treaty. We don't even know what this idea of truth telling is, because there's not a lot of telling the truth going on anyway. It'll be taken advantage of by some of our most privileged Aboriginal people who have had a seat at the table. The marginalised will continue to be forgotten, but it'll now encroach. These demands will encroach on everyday Australians, those, looking into private investment, those looking into attempting to invest in places like the Northern Territory, where we need big projects, infrastructure projects, where we need, to support mining industries, cattle industries, and those sorts of things. It'll begin to encroach on all of those things that contribute to the greater good of the nation in terms of our economic strength. And when it encroaches on that and cripples our economic strength, we can't support our most marginalised, who involve everybody in our communities. And I mean, I see this as, when the demands keep going and they're not being met, challenges will be brought to the High Court. That's what will happen. Despite proponents of the voice attempting to say that, that's not going to happen. It will happen. It's happening in New Zealand. It'll happen here in Australia. And again, the argument being from, the Uluru Statement and the Voice is that this is about unifying the nation. This is already dividing the nation right now. There's nothing about unity in this.
It looks like, a lot of more division ahead if it comes in. So I wanted to ask you, there were a few Jews brought to Australia on the First Fleet. However, the vast majority of Australia's Jewish community traces its arrival to post-Holocaust more recently. So should newer arrivals be less equal in the Australian Constitution, or do you think their contributions should be celebrated?
Look, and this is a huge issue right now that we forget. When there's this argument between supposed issues between black and white Australia, we forget that we're a nation that's filled with migrants, that's filled with people of many different backgrounds, whether, our community members, they can trace back to the First Fleet, or they can trace back to last year to make, and refugees that have come to this country to make an opportunity for themselves. This is what is wonderful and what we have to celebrate about the country. But very often, and particularly with this voice proposal, it ignores that element of our country. And this is quite often I'm approached regularly by migrants who sort of say, well, this is a little bit unfair. Why aren't we being considered in this debate? Why are we being pushed aside? Why are we not as important as those who first came here? And if you want to look at it in a spiritual context, the way in which I was brought up in the Northern Territory is understanding that for anybody who was born in Alice Springs, in Central Australia, where I come from, the elders, my elders taught me that they too hold the spiritual essence of the creator ancestor of that land within them, because we believe when our mother first becomes pregnant, that's when your baby spirit has leapt from the ground and into your mother's belly, giving you your personal dreaming story. So it is our belief that anyone who was born here in this country belongs here just as much as, the first Australians. So to me, that upbringing that I've had is what real reconciliation looks like. And unfortunately, in the current political climate, I feel like the migrant community is often forgotten about, and that's a real shame. I'm certainly a believer in a unified nation that involves us all and prioritizes everybody, but serves us on the basis of need and not on race.
100%. It's definitely a vision that we should be working towards. I've just got one final question. So some of the most prominent advocates for the voice are Jewish, but they live in the wealthy neighborhoods of Sydney and Melbourne. You're on the ground in the Northern Territory. So if Jewish people actually want to help improve Indigenous people's lives, rather than just engaging in feel-good advocacy, what can we do without the voice? How can we contribute? What's the best way to help?
There's some wonderful organisations. I think the best way to help is to support the generations coming up through Indigenous education, programs that support our kids particularly from remote communities, to get an education and to do boarding school elsewhere in the country, to open the world up to them. I mean, that is one of the best ways you can support through action as well. I know the AIEF, Australian Indigenous Education Foundation, do a great job of that. Warren Mundine's on the board of that. But there are ways, it doesn't take much to do a bit of research and find out how people, how they can be more effective in terms of supporting, because certainly, standing up and doing an acknowledgement to country or, providing lip service doesn't actually change much on the ground. And there are certainly ways, more meaningful ways that people can contribute. And if you've got the time spare, visit a remote community, go and have a look for yourselves, because life is completely different in places like the Northern Territory than it is, in the northern suburbs of Sydney. And I spent a lot of time in both, so I understand, the complete contrast in both those places. But until people see for themselves, they won't know. And there are a lot of very frustrated Indigenous Australians like myself who's worked my way into Parliament with the other 10 Indigenous representatives. And I've done so because of the fact that I have understood that we've got a lot of gatekeepers in the Indigenous industry who have done very well out of the Indigenous industry. And now it is they who want to insert themselves into the Constitution to maintain their influence and their power, because why would they want to relinquish that? And if they can strengthen it, well, it's certainly going to do them a lot of it's going to do them well, serve them well. So we've got a democracy, and I don't believe we should be mucking around with our founding document as we do, and our democracy has demonstrated that over time we have been able to accomplish what it was recognised we needed as a nation decades ago, is that we needed Aboriginal representation in Parliament. That's what we've got. And I don't want my voice to then become redundant along with the 10 other voices in here if this proposal should succeed.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Senator Jacinta Price. It's been a real honour. We're wishing you all the best, and I'm sure we're going to have a lot to hear from you in the years ahead. So thank you so much for joining me.
Appreciate it. Thank you.